This video is about who held political power in Elizabethan England. Now, the first person who we're going to talk about is Elizabeth herself. As monarch, she held the most significant political power in England. But she wasn't on her own. We're going to talk about individuals and groups of people that helped her rule. Now, the first group I want to talk to you about is what we call the royal court. Don't think of the royal court as a place, like a courtroom. The royal court essentially went wherever Queen Elizabeth went. And so if Elizabeth moved from one of her great royal palaces to the other, the court moved with her. It says there in the box on the left, it was run by the Lord Chamberlain. I'll tell you a little bit more about that later in the video. But to be a courtier, a member of the royal court, quite often you had to be from a famous family or a noble, a lord or an earl, and you would have a title to match your status in society. And if you were a key member of the royal court, a key courtier, you would be able to speak personally and frequently with the king. And in an age of what we call personal monarchy, where decisions are made by the individual based on the advice they get, to be a powerful courtier was a very influential role in Elizabethan England indeed. Now, one job for courtiers and the royal court was to go on a progress with the Queen. And like I said, wherever the Queen went, the royal court went. And a progress was essentially a summer trip out for Queen Elizabeth. And she doesn't tend to get very far. I'll talk about that in a moment. The idea was for Elizabeth to visit her country, to visit England. She doesn't get very far north, to be honest. She spends a lot of her time in the east and the southeast, and she only gets as far north as the Midlands. Actually, there was a very influential woman of the time, Bess of Hardwick. She was the wife of the Earl of Shrewsbury, and she built New Hardwick Hall. And the second floor of the entire house was designed entirely for a visit for the Queen. She had a bedroom built in anticipation for a visit from the Queen. She was waiting at any moment for the Queen to visit on one of her progresses, but the Queen never got there. So areas of Hardwick Hall in Derbyshire were built for a visit from a Queen that never came. Some historians have said that it was a big PR exercise, and one way of keeping the powerful individuals of the country on side was to go on these progresses. It was a moment of great status for the family if they were honoured with a visit from the Queen, but it would come at a great cost to them as well. And some of these families would rack up a considerable bill hosting feasts and parties and entertainments for their Queen. And it wasn't just the Queen that would turn up, the closest courtiers would go with her, up to 400-500 sometimes. And on these progresses, of course, the Queen would travel in luxury, visiting the noble and powerful families of England on a journey. Another place of political influence and power is Parliament. But Parliament was very different in the Tudor era to today. First of all, the House of Lords was bigger and more powerful than the House of Commons. That's not the case today. But also, historians say that Parliament was an event rather than a place. But Parliament would be called and dismissed at the order of the Queen. She would decide how long Parliament met for. If laws wanted to change, or in most cases the Queen wanted to increase taxes, Parliament would be called. And for Elizabeth, Parliament was inconvenient. Parliament was something that if she could, she'd rather do without. But it was a necessity because Parliament approved new taxes. In reality, Parliament was much less powerful in the Tudor era than it is today. Because it didn't meet regularly, because Elizabeth had ultimate control, it wasn't particularly powerful. Of Elizabeth's 45-year rule, it sat for 3 years of those 45. And actually within that time it would meet for as little as 2 or 3 months. Elizabeth could dismiss Parliament whenever she wanted and veto any law that they tried to pass. And actually, later on, we will see Parliament try to discuss Elizabeth's marriage prospects in the course, and she shuts Parliament down because she doesn't believe that it's Parliament's job to discuss her marriage. So Parliament is more of a place to advise the Queen rather than to pass laws and hope the Queen agrees with them. Even then, the advice that Parliament gives isn't necessarily going to be followed or listened to by Elizabeth, who was particularly headstrong and in many cases believed that she knew better than the politicians in Parliament. Now, one way of getting real political influence is through what we call patronage. Now, patronage is essentially a word to describe giving political jobs to influential people and influential families in return for their loyalty. So for Elizabeth, many of her what we call privy chamber, people who saw her on a day-to-day basis, were female, because it would be unsuitable for her to be surrounded by men day and night. Actually, there's a story of the Earl of Essex storming in to discuss a matter with the Queen while she was getting changed, and she was horrified, and it almost ruined their relationship. So the people that saw the Queen on day-to-day matters were women, and again, in the sexism of the time, it wasn't considered right or proper that for a woman or a group of women to be discussing the political matters of the day. So she needed to work alongside men when she was discussing politics. And so what she decided to do is give these positions of influence, these important roles, to individuals that she favoured. And we'll look at some of those now. And for many individuals, getting these roles and the titles and the responsibility that comes with it often raised their status in general in the nation. It ensured that individuals who were influential and influential families remained loyal to Elizabeth if she granted them these jobs. On the next slide, we're going to look at examples of some of the roles that people could be granted. So first up is Lord Lieutenants and Justices of the Peace. So a Lord Lieutenant was appointed by the Queen and represented an area of the country. They collected taxes on behalf of the Queen and settled local disputes. And Elizabeth relies on these individuals to keep different regions almost under control. In a similar role was Justices of the Peace, or JPs. And there were several of these in each county to ensure that law and order was kept. And they again were selected from what we call the local gentry, the middle class. And again, they made sure that the laws were followed. Justices of the Peace had the power to arrest people if the laws weren't followed, but a single Justice of the Peace couldn't sentence somebody to death. They needed to have the agreement of another justice or more. They had to take an oath to swear to treat everybody equally, no matter their status, whether they are rich or poor. You might be unsurprised to hear and to see that powerful and wealthy individuals who were close with or knew JPs were more likely to receive lenient treatment compared to those living in poverty. So at a local level, these people were really important. It was a job of high status in a local government role, but it also, we said before on the progresses, Elizabeth physically never travelled further north than the Midlands. And so these roles, Lords, Lieutenants and JPs, were so important in those areas that didn't feel as close a connection to the Queen and to the royal court. But the real power was held in the Privy Council. And in a moment, we're going to talk about some of those key individuals in the Privy Council. Now, the word privy isn't really in our vocabulary today. We would use private rather than privy. But the Privy Council was a small group of influential, knowledgeable men in the world of politics who helped the Queen rule the country. And the big ideas were discussed in the Privy Council. And Elizabeth relied on the Privy Council considerably when making decisions. Now, technically, they advised the Queen and she made the final decision, but some individuals had quite a lot of influence over her. These men were powerful in their own right. They could make proclamations on the Queen's behalf. They could command the arrest of an individual, or they could command the imprisonment of an individual on behalf of the Queen. And because they had so much responsibility, they had to have the trust of Elizabeth. As you can see in the box on the right, it says that Elizabeth's first council only had 19 members. By the end of her reign, that had been reduced to 13. So this was a very small elite circle of experienced and trusted political advisors from the nobility, from the highest group, the most wealthy and powerful group in society. In the next few slides, we're going to look at the 4 key members of Elizabeth's Privy Council. Now, the first is arguably the most influential, Sir William Cecil, who later on is given the title Lord Burleigh. So when you see Sir William Cecil and Lord Burleigh, that is the same person. But there is another Cecil, which you will find out about in just a moment. So Cecil was born into the gentry. He went to Cambridge University and served on Edward VI's council. And when Elizabeth came to the throne, there was a need to get experienced Protestant politicians back into key roles in politics. And that is why Cecil finds himself in the Queen's Privy Council, because of his experience working with and advising the young Edward VI. Now, Elizabeth was known to be a monarch that did not necessarily like dissent, but one thing she admired about Cecil is that he was brave enough to disagree with her and speak his mind. He was rewarded with the role of Lord Treasurer in 1572, which essentially means that he was in charge of the Queen's finances and making sure that the country's finances were healthy. And as I said before, a lot of these key roles in politics could be passed down from father to son in powerful families. And that is the case. When Sir William Cecil dies towards the end of Elizabeth's reign, he's replaced by Robert Cecil. And he actually then becomes a key advisor to King James after Elizabeth's death. So we see the same influential families remaining in these high-profile positions. And next up is someone who was personally close to Elizabeth for most of their lives. So Robert Dudley's father was the Duke of Northumberland, who was executed by Mary I because of his support for the ascension of Lady Jane Grey to the throne. So Robert Dudley comes from a Puritan family, and the Puritans were a group of Protestants that were particularly clear about how they wished Protestants to worship, and that was that it would be very different and distinct from Catholicism. So Robert Dudley and Elizabeth were childhood friends. As they grow up, there are rumours of a romantic relationship, and for a time, Robert Dudley is responsible for Elizabeth's personal safety, and because of that, Dudley sees and speaks with the Queen on a regular basis. He's made the Earl of Leicester in 1564, but had served on the Privy Council before then, and argued with Sir William Cecil about a whole manner of things. He was more in favour of war than Robert Cecil was, so they argued about how to deal in particular with Spain. And they also disagreed over the succession crisis. Now, Robert Dudley was someone who was briefly considered to be a potential match for Elizabeth, but it was never going to be possible because of his marriages. But when we get on to Elizabeth and her suitors, we'll come back to Robert Dudley. And key person number 3 is Sir Francis Walsingham. So like Cecil, he went to Cambridge. Like Dudley, he was a Puritan. And actually, his safety wasn't guaranteed under Mary I, and he fled the country when Mary became queen. When Elizabeth comes to the throne in 1558, he comes back to the country because of his loyalty to Elizabeth and becomes an MP. So he's a member of Parliament. He then begins 10 years later to work in government and start to have a more influential role, eventually leading up to him being granted a knighthood in 1577. Walsingham and Dudley were a lot closer and a lot more likely to agree on political matters, and Walsingham and Cecil regularly clashed. Essentially, Francis Walsingham's job was the spy master, and he was in charge of uncovering any plots against Elizabeth. Now, as a Puritan, he was very suspicious of Catholic plots against the Queen. And it's him, Walsingham, and his team of spies that essentially uncover the plot to kill Elizabeth and replace her on the throne with Mary, Queen of Scots. And the final straw is the Babington plot, unearthed in 1586, and it is the unearthing of that plot which leads to the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots. Again, more of that later. So we'll come back to Dudley when we look at Elizabeth and potential matches for a husband, and we'll come back to Walsingham when we look at threats and plots against Elizabeth. Walsingham dies in 1590, about 13 or so years before the Queen does. And finally, we have Sir Christopher Hatton. We have sort of this record of Cambridge-educated individuals. We've now got one who went to Oxford. And Sir Christopher Hatton was a Protestant, but he was more sympathetic of Catholics than Puritans were. And Sir Christopher Hatton was very suspicious of Puritans. And Sir Christopher Hatton initially catches Elizabeth's eye because apparently he was a particularly good dancer, and he was seen dancing at court, and Elizabeth was impressed by it. Now, what happens over time is he sort of advances through the royal court and finds himself in the Privy Council. He becomes captain of the Queen's bodyguard, and it's his job essentially to organise the Queen's progresses up and down the country. But as I said before, there's not as much up as there is down. But Sir Christopher Hatton was the man in charge of making sure that Elizabeth and the royal court had the time and the space to go on these progresses, and so he arranged where the Queen was able to visit in those hot summers. Now, because he was a member of the House of Lords, he was in Parliament on several occasions, and that meant that he was able to organise MPs and try and get them to vote in line with what the Queen wanted them to do. And in 1587, he's made Lord Chancellor. Okay, so there we have it. There is your video on who held political power in Elizabethan England. We started off by talking about the Queen herself, the royal court, and progresses. We then moved on to discuss very briefly the role that Parliament played. Remember, though, that Parliament is not as powerful and as influential in the Tudor period as it is today. We then went on to talk about the Privy Council and some key individuals in Elizabeth's Privy Council. Now, the idea of videos such as this is that you can watch them out of lesson time. We can then sort of put some notes together, either with structured help from me, or you can do them yourself, and then we can go back into the classroom and apply our new knowledge to an exam question. And hopefully that will both speed up the teaching of the course, but also help you trying to deal with the amount of content that you need to learn in order to sit your history exam. So if you need to go back and make some notes, if a sheet hasn't been provided, please do so, and expect this knowledge to be applied to an exam question in the classroom very soon.